James, I'm getting a weird sound from your end. It's like I don't know.
It could be the rain though, because it's raining here.
Just at the end. No, it's not. Definitely not rain. It's weird.
Okay.
It's yeah. Okay. I think we're good to go. Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome back to Tokyo Jazz Joints. This is episode 4. It's going to be part 1 of a 3-parter, and we're going to focus in these next 3 episodes on the one and only Shinjuku, or Shinjuku as it's really meant to be pronounced. Amazing place in Tokyo. Totally unique. If you've been to Tokyo, there's a fairly good chance it's one of the places along with Shibuya that you'll probably go visit. James, how are you this week?
Feeling great, Philip. Another wonderfully fast week locked down here in the city of Yokohama. How about you in Dublin?
Same. Yeah, short week. We had Easter Monday off. That was good. And already it's Friday and it's time to record the podcast again, which is a nice feeling. We've had about over 1,500 listeners on SoundCloud stats since in the last 7 days, which is fantastic because, I know we often joke about how niche jazz joints are in general. So it's good to know that there's actually people out there listening to us and got some nice feedback and some nice comments from people.
Really good feedback as well. Yeah, really good feedback. And it's not just because people are bored at home and they've run out of shows to watch on Netflix. I think they're actually interested in the project and the stories that we got to tell about it. So, we love hearing from everybody who's been checking it out, and keep the comments coming in. It's great stuff.
Yeah. So let's crack on then. So we're going to cover a few places today. We're going to kind of ease in with a bit of an appetizer. Then we'll go to sort of like I don't know, what comes after an appetizer? Fish course, maybe? And then the main course is kind of going to be the meat of the episode this week. So we're going to start with Black Sun. And Black Sun's one of the places I think, when I think back, like we photographed pretty early on in the project. And when I looked at the photos this morning, I was kind of thinking, they've got that, for me anyway, that kind of nervousness that I suppose I mentioned in one of the other episodes about being quite early on and maybe kind of not wanting to get in people's faces or kind of disrupt or disturb people by taking pictures. So there's a kind of a shyness about the photographs in my impression anyway. And I suppose if I had the chance to go back again, I'd probably shoot something different or shoot them differently, I guess. But tell us a bit about Black Sun. I think it's the one that's on the site is the second version. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's called the Black Sun Jazz Club. Although that's stretching it a bit, it's really just one square room. Although they do have live music 2-3 times a week. It's in its second location. That's right. The first location used to be near the train tracks in Shinjuku, and it was a great little spot, a real dinky old building where you climbed up these narrow stairs, and it was divided into 2 separate floors. The first floor was just the counter where you would sit with Ujie-san, the owner. He was a real cool cat. And then upstairs were a couple little tables. But that building got torn down. Same story we've heard over and over again. These old buildings with these great old jazz spots. The owner wants to sell it off, and so the jazz spots got to either move or close down. But luckily, Ujie-san was able to move even to a more central spot in Shinjuku, in Kabukicho, which is sort of the red light district. And he opened up in a bigger space, and then he started doing live music. And he's been running the joint, I think, for about 40 years. And it's funny you mentioned the nervousness that you could feel in the photographs, because my memory of Black Sun, when we went there, I had not seen the new place yet. This was the first time I went to the new one. And I was really happy because he remembered me. I had maybe gone to the old shop 3 or 4 years earlier. I didn't expect him to remember me, obviously. But once we started chatting, he was like, yeah, I remember you because you were asking me a lot of questions. Don't get a lot of foreign people in here asking questions about my jazz bar. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's probably true. But yeah, a great little spot, and definitely one that I think, for people who are visiting Japan, it's not what their idea of a jazz club would be. They're thinking of something a lot more fancy with a stage and whatnot. But in Japan, and we've seen this over and over again, there's live music in the smallest of rooms, and you can see from the photos that you have up on the site, you're pretty much surrounding the musicians in this place, so it's very, very warm.
Yeah, I remember it being quite hard to photograph. I think it was kind of, I feel like there was something going on, or they were like setting up or finishing a gig, or there was some, I can't remember exactly. We went like a weird time. Or
They were setting up. It
wasn't quite open,
yeah.
right? Yeah,
yeah. They
I
were
remember
doing
being
sound check.
I
Yeah.
remember it being sort of hard to kind of photograph. It was kind of one of those spaces that was very symmetrical. It was quite tricky to get, because I noticed even looking at the photograph of the instruments, it's actually taken in the reflection of a picture, I think, because all the writing's backwards, and there's that big, ugly, massive printer right in the middle of the whole setup. But yeah, I always remember that the Louis Armstrong poster in particular. That one always sort of sticks in my mind. But yeah, it was a nice place, and I think must have been probably, I guess, in the first 20 or so places that we did, when we were kind of focusing maybe initially on more sort of central areas in Tokyo. So what about Shinjuku? I mean, it sort of has that resonance. I think it has a different resonance for different people. But I remember certainly, particularly when I first went to Japan, and back in 97, when I first arrived, flown over by the program that I was on, and amazingly in those days, business class. One of the few times I've managed that, and
very fancy.
Yeah, and I remember arriving there, and we were sort of bussed from the airport to the west side of Shinjuku, which again, it's sort of divided by those train tracks. And the west side, for those of you who don't know, it's full of skyscrapers. It's quite open. It looks properly planned. There's a lot of greenery, and then you cross the tracks. And the east side is just like this crazy amount of buildings and narrow alleyways, and endless amounts of bars and shops, and just that complete sensory overload. And I remember, like, we arrived there and we were put up in I think it was the KO Plaza I stayed in. I had to share a room with someone else on the program who I'd never met before, which I remember being really awkward. And those first 3 days in Japan, just head completely spinning. We'd have this orientation in the daytime, and then at night, just wander aimlessly around Shinjuku. And when I think back now, like to that, I was 22 at the time, and just wandering around, like the light, the sort of bright lights of Kabukicho and that east exit of Shinjuku Station, like it's kind of mad to me to think that, and then you walk back to this very peaceful kind of sort of quite demure, west side of the station, which is, at night pretty quiet, and it's just essentially, government offices and hotels and stuff.
That's a perfect description, because the train tracks split it in half completely. The west side, which used to be the old reservoir in the 60s, that was where the big water reservoir is. And the reason they built the big buildings there was because that's where the land is safe. In the land of earthquakes, they can only build skyscrapers in certain places. So
right, yeah.
That's why you get that big divide. But it's funny you mentioned that, because I had a very similar experience. I also came in 1997. I was 23. And literally the first place I got on the train to go to was Shinjuku, because I was a big Japanese movie fan. And I had seen, there's a classic of the Japanese New Wave called Diary of a Shinjuku Thief, where you see the main character walking in Kinokuniya bookstore. So that was the first place I went to on my second day in Japan. I sat down on the steps outside of the Kinokuniya bookstore, which is right near Shinjuku Station. And at that point, I knew that there was a lot of jazz here. But I think, as we mentioned on the other shows, this was pre-internet, really, and couldn't speak the language. I didn't know where to find any of these places. So the jazz part of Shinjuku really only opened up to me, after a couple of years.
And so it was kind of
2 or 3 years.
It was like I know it was a sort of a black market immediately after the war, but the 60s, it was very much like Bohemia, wasn't it? It was the kind of the hub of counterculture and
well, completely. Actually, yeah, you mentioned the black market. That is correct. I mean, the day after the war ended, the black market opened up, and then the next day, a lot of the bars opened up, including jazz bars. So there was always like jazz. And then in the 60s, you're right, it became completely like the scene of counterculture, a lot of the riots against the government by Japanese students. And there was, at its peak, I think there were upwards of about 30 or 40 jazz kisaten in the Shinjuku area. It's kind of hard to imagine now. Right?
Yeah, wow.
40, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's only maybe about 10 or 15 left. But yeah, that started in the 1960s. And then what happened was, because Shinjuku is as big as a downtown of a lot of cities around the world, so you've got little different pockets of it, like you mentioned. So next to Kabukicho, which was the red light district where the Black Sun is, directly to the east, is the famous Golden Gai area.
Yeah.
And that area was, pretty much where the brothels were after the war. And then it got took over by all the bohemians and the artists. So each little neighborhood had its own kind of vibe going on. So you had the cafes, you had the bars, and then you had the live clubs as well.
Well, it's funny because like after my sort of 3-day odyssey wandering around Shinjuku, as a sort of a wet behind the ears 22-year-old from Belfast, I was sort of bussed off to Yokohama actually initially, and I did this homestay about 10-15 minutes south of Yokohama Station. And I remember talking to the family there about, being in Shinjuku, and they sort of kind of did that intake of breath. And there's very much this idea in Japan. A lot of people, even still today, if you mention Shinjuku, there's a kind of abunai, and it's very much seen as like a dangerous area, right? Even for Tokyoites,
Oh yeah, certainly is. And I mean, look, it's all relative by Japanese standards. Yeah, there's fights going on. I remember one night wandering home drunkenly from some jazz bar and seeing a pretty vicious fight break out in an alleyway. But I mean, still, like, I'm from New York City. I mean, my standard of a dangerous neighborhood is very different to Japanese people. So, and one thing to remember as well is that we're foreigners, and it's very unlikely that even in the roughest of Japanese environments, that if you keep your head down and your wits up, nobody's going to bother you here. And that's something that really served us well going into the jazz bars, because it was almost like sometimes, they're more, nervous of us than we would be of them.
And I think what's interesting about Shinjuku is like, there are parts of it, it's got a real shady feel to a lot of it, but also like a lot of Japan, a lot of big cities, there's this constant mixture of like totally asinine shops and like nice bars, nice cafes, places that music fans have opened up, then like, kind of red light type places. And if you wander around, the corner a bit from Black Sun, you get to Narcissus, which is the second place we're going to chat about today. And actually the first photograph of Narcissus on the website, I think really kind of sums up Shinjuku in a way, because you've got these two kind of slightly sketchy looking guys hanging around outside a really gaudy kind of like neon shop. And they're checking out this girl wandering in to the building, and you can see already within that building, there's different types of bars. And then, of course, there's the sign for Narcissus. So, there's this really very mellow, very kind of stylish, very Japanese style in every sense, jazz bar. But, next to it, it's got this kind of, very Shinjuku, in your face kind of type. I think it's a shop, so it is.
That's exactly right. And in Shinjuku, you'll find in not even just the same street, like I think we talked about in previous episode, maybe in the last episode, the same building in Japan is going to have 15 to 20 different bars or establishments, and that could cover a wide range of things. Yeah. And in Shinjuku, that's going to go way, way off into the red light area. You know what I mean? And Narcissus is really interesting because the lady that runs it, Kawashima-san, who I would estimate is probably in her mid-70s by now. She's been there pretty much since the 1960s. And so she's seen so much of post-war Japan and so much of Shinjuku as it developed and changed over time. But the jazz kiseten was like a really, really big part of it. I mean, as we had mentioned before, these people were kind of on the outskirts, they're outcasts in Japanese society, right? And so it from their view, there's nothing strange about having the jazz cafe next to the sex toy shop and then next to a hostess bar. But on the first floor could be just a regular tavern where people would go after work. And it all exists in harmony together.
Yeah, we never asked her about the name. I was doing a bit of, research on the name there, and it's obviously from Greek mythology, and apparently Narcissus was a hunter who loved all things beautiful. And I think like you really see that reflected in her place, because some of the photographs, if you take it from a certain angle, it just looks like a beautiful, very kind of like organic Japanese izakaya. There's sort of ikebana, there's these lonely looking branches in beautifully handcrafted pots and things like that. And then if you turn around, you see the row of spirits, and you see all these like photographs of jazz musicians. And I remember like at the time, I think we asked her as we do in most places, we asked her permission to take photographs. And I remember her being a little bit, kind of like, well, okay, then, so it had to be done sort of a little more stealthily. And I think that she specifically sort of requested that she didn't appear in any of them, which again is something that we've had from a few owners and actually often, particularly somewhere like Miles, I think as well, the lady there said the same thing, that they didn't want to be photographed themselves. And that it seems to come from this kind of humility and, oh no, what would you want to take a photograph of me for?
Yes, exactly.
Even though they're always beautiful, but
just an old lady, you don't want to take my picture.
Yeah.
But it's incredible because over and over again, we've had these experiences where you go in and a small little cafe in the red light district, run by this beautiful old lady who's talking with us and always complimenting us on our Japanese. And you just, you've gotten into this little vibe here. And then I always remember in Narcissus going back to the bathroom and seeing a picture on the wall, and it was a picture of Charles Gale. So for listeners out there who don't know, Charles Gale was a saxophone player from America who played extremely heavy free jazz. Very cacophonous. And I recognized in the picture that he was here in Narcissus, that picture was taken here, and he's playing his horn. So I asked Kawashima-san, am I confused about something? But did you do a gig here? And she said, oh, yeah, in the 1980s, when Japan was very rich, what they call the bubble years, a lot of the jazz musicians would just get flown over to play private gigs or small gigs. And so one of her customers, who was a construction company president, which means he made millions in the bubble years, he loved really heavy free jazz, so he used to fly people over. And so she had pictures of various people like Charles Gale or Anthony Braxton. Seriously, the kind of people you would not expect to be playing in a tiny little cafe in Tokyo. Yeah. And she brought them over. Now, unfortunately, that era had passed, and she was quite, astonished that I was so taken with the photograph. She was like, oh, well, it's no big deal. These guys used to come here all the time. And I'm like, are you kidding me? These guys used to play in this cafe. So if you're looking at the pictures now online, you'll see how tiny Narcissus is as a cafe. So imagine hearing very, very heavy free jazz in there. It would just be an unbelievable experience. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think again, we shot this pretty early in the project, but yeah, it's such a narrow space. It's a classic kind of Japanese long, narrow, badly lit space. There's people open up shops and bars and restaurants in these spaces. A lot of people living in this style of space as well. But I think for me, I love the photograph. I just got lucky, really. It was one of those classic ones where you just got lucky, where we got this guy, kind of blue-collar worker. He's got his company overalls on, and he just happened to be reading the liner notes of the Africa Brass Coltrane album. And you've got that old Showa era pink payphone,
beautiful
right in the shot. So yeah, I was so pleased with that one. It's been exhibited a couple of times earlier on in the project, and it's just a gorgeous space, just somewhere you could sit for.
Well, that's
hours.
The thing, Phil. We always come back to this, is that the beauty of these jazz kisaten, especially, is yes, you go in there and you could sit for 3 or 4 hours, and I've done this a lot of times in my life, and just listen to record after record, and you're in a completely hermetically sealed world, and the beautiful pink payphone just is the icing on top. Who knows if that even works? And so many of the jazz keystons still have these old payphones. It's like I wonder if they realize that some people like us love it because it's sort of vintage, But I've never seen anyone use them. God knows if they work or not. But that photo has always been one of my favorites as well, because it was perfectly captured.
Yeah.
And people have actually asked me as well, did you guys stage some of the photographs of people? Customers, did you have to ask permission? I'm like, oh no. In fact, Philip actually took most of them secretly, so we didn't stage anything.
Yeah, nothing's staged. The only thing probably is the portraits, but again, they're staged in the sense of I ask if I can photograph, and then you've got this kind of 30-second to 45-second window where you've got to get it, because they often get so embarrassed, and it sort of all gets a bit uncomfortable, just because of that Japanese thing. Often they're just kind of a bit shy in front of the camera. I mean, customers, some of them are photographed, but I generally try to photograph customers. If I photograph them, it's usually from behind or to a point where they're not recognizable and stuff like that. But that one particularly, I just got lucky. I remember we were actually sat at that table just down at the end, and so we were able to kind of look right up, and you can see those speakers as well tucked up in that kind of little butsu-down shelf up above the back window, and it's just a fantastic space, So.
A classic joint, and what's really amazing is that she was able to keep it going because, like we said, in the heyday in Shinjuku, there would have been 20 more cafes at least, very similar to this one. And for reasons unknown, she has been able to keep it going where all the other ones either had to close because the rent went up or just, the trends changed. But the fact that she's been there that long is just it's so special.
So that brings us on to the main event, which I think, for me is probably one of my favorite places. It's one of my favorite experiences. I love the photographs, if you're allowed to say that about your own stuff. But
why not? Come on. No false modesty here. Yeah.
All right, fair enough. It's Shiramuren in Golden Gai in Shinjuku, and you mentioned Golden Gai. So again, for those of you who don't know, it's probably a lot better known now than it probably was in the past. But it's become quite popular with tourists now. But it's basically a little I suppose, enclave of tiny, tiny little bars, all shoved in a tiny area, kind of like got a sort of a shanty town shack sort of vibe. And basically,
literally one square block, if you're thinking in terms of size from like a city in the West. I mean, it's one square block with about 6 or 7 alleyways that go parallel to each other.
Yep.
And each alleyway, as you can see from the first photo on the site, if you're looking at Shiramuren, you can see that each alleyway has got upwards of about 30 to 40 bars. Yep. So there's something along the lines of around 200 bars in this tiny little square block.
And they basically, if you go in the daytime, it's like a ghost town. You might see the odd person cleaning the steps or getting stuff ready, but it really comes alive at night. And I think this was really early on, and it was a bit of a legendary place, I think, because I think, first of all, the owner was kind of famous for being, let's say, not the most hospitable, probably the nicest way to put it, but
that's being very generous. Yes,
certainly a bit grumpy, not to put too fine a point on it. So we actually went there twice, and I remember the first time because he was so terrifying that I think the only place that I photographed was in the bathroom, which I think I photographed with my phone, or maybe I took I tend to take my camera into the bathroom just in case, because a lot of the bathrooms in these places are just as worthy of photographing. But just to get an idea of this place, I mean, I think there's basically, I think, 8 stools, and you could almost touch both sides of the bar if you put your arms out. It's so narrow and so cramped. And I think the first time we went, it was pretty warm as well. Like the window was open and it was pretty kind of hot and sweaty. And we went in, and again, not a massive menu. And I think we ordered a beer, and he gave us 2 kind of like 1.5 liter bottles of beer each. He just took the tops off them, sort of thumped them down on the counter, and then poured us a bowl of like those really dry, chalky beans that they use for setsubun, for throwing at the devil. And
I was thinking more along the lines of what I used to feed my dog for a snack.
It's that kind of vibe, yeah.
That kind of dry snack. I mean, Otsuka-san, the owner, is incredible. He, the first time I had been there, so I had been to Shiramuren many times before I took you there. But I would say it was really only the 3rd time that I went before he would talk to me. So, I'd had a rule from my own website where I was trying to profile these joints. I'd always go right when they opened so I could talk to the owner before it got crowded. And the first 2 times I went there, he just wouldn't talk to me. And he was extremely intimidating, as you said. You can see from the photo that you have of him here. But I decided, okay, look, I love the little joint. It was just so atmospheric. It was completely out of an old Japanese movie. I'm going to go back again. And the third time I went, he remembered me and he finally opened up. I wouldn't say that he was the warmest guy, but we did have a good 30 or 45-minute chat. He even told me about his family, that he had a daughter and he lived in this part of Tokyo, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it just took him a little while. Also because, and we'll get into this on another episode of the podcast, but because Shinjuku and Golden Gai and Tokyo in general has changed, these kind of little bars have been getting a lot more tourists. And for the owners who don't speak English, they don't really know how to handle that. And so I think he felt a little bit stressed out about it. And so he would put on this gruff exterior.
Yeah.
The other thing that's quite amazing about Otsuka-san is that, and you can't quite see it from the picture here, is that he only has one arm. So he works the entire bar just with his right arm and right hand. I asked him about what had happened, and he just looked at me very, very coldly and just said, it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
So you
Which
can
sort of
imagine.
just adds to the mystery of the whole place. But we did wonder maybe the first time, that we went together, if, that's also maybe part of it. Maybe he does get asked, or, it's just a kind of a, there's a kind of a defense already up there. And it's amazing to watch because there's actually really nowhere. I mean, the bar that you see him standing in is so narrow that he kind of sits on a little footstool behind, inside that bar space. And, he's mixing drinks there. He prepares, little snacky type food that you get for your seating charge and stuff like that. And he does this whole thing. I think also what's distinctive about that place is that at some point, presumably, he switched his whole collection of vinyl over to CDs, and so there's really no vinyl at all there now anymore.
Oh yes, that's right, and you can see it in the photographs. And when I asked him about that, I remember he looked at me like I was simple. He was just like he looked at me like, how am I going to get 5,000 records in here? And I was like, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Golden Gai, how would you get that many records? I know from some of the other bars that they would just rotate them. They would bring in like a box of 50 or a couple boxes of 100 and then replace them, rotate them every week or so from their house. But he decided, I think sometime in the 80s, to just get rid of his vinyl collection. And start buying CDs and put it in the bar. And as you can see, he's got a couple thousand.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes as well, I suppose that there's somewhere like Golden Gai, particularly. I suppose there's always the fire thing as well. Like if one of those places happens to go up, the whole place is going up, really, isn't it? Because it's so tightly packed and so narrow that a record collection could disappear very quickly if something like that happened. But I think so. We came away the first time, and I was really finding my feet in terms of photographing the places back then. And I remember coming away being so annoyed that I hadn't taken any pictures. But in a way, I'm kind of glad because like I've said before, if you're told no or you refuse permission to photograph, then you really have nowhere to go. And I think to not have included somewhere like Shiramuren in the project would have been a real tragedy. And so we went back much later on, I think probably actually not long before I left in July 17. And again, we went in, there was again no one there at that time. And I remember again it being pretty hot and sweaty, and I just, again, pure luck, but you can actually see, and it's pretty bad, and probably you wouldn't notice if you didn't point it out, but in the photograph of the master there, you can actually see my camera bag just in the foreground, because I think, again, it was just that moment of this is the shot, and I just captured that one image of him, and I think it just sums him up, because he doesn't give much away, does he? And I remember that second time that we went back together, he was much more talkative, and there was a definite change.
Yeah, definitely. I think he wants to know, and then look, that's probably the case for a lot of these bar owners. They want to know that you're not just coming in to take your Instagram pics and have a travel experience. I mean, he's got a small place. You can see there's 4 stools in the photo that you've got here. And once you show that you're going to come back and be a regular customer, he will start talking with you. And I remember, I think it might have been that second time we went back, but one of the regular customers who came in, who was even younger than us, but clearly they knew each other, he was quite chatty with.
That's right, yeah.
So it just took a little time. It's so funny, Philip, because I'm looking at the picture with the window in the background. And so we were there in the summer. This would have been probably 6:30, maybe 7 o'clock.
Yeah,
it's still light out. But I've had a couple nights in Shiramuren sitting by that window where I missed the last train. And one day you can kind of see out the window how close the opposite building is with the other bars there. And I remember hearing a little rustling noise as I was sitting next to the window, and I looked out, and there was just a gigantic rat sitting right outside the window, so looking through the window at me. And there's no screen, there's nothing. And all I could think about was I don't want to die from a rat bite in a jazz bar in Shinjuku. And then I thought, well, you know what? There might be worse ways to go than that. I mean, that would be very appropriate for me.
There's definitely worse ways to go.
Yeah, but that's the kind of vibe in Shinjuku, is that it's really interesting because, again, people have this view of Japan and of Tokyo, who've not been here, of being so sleek and modern and robotic and anime and all of that. And yes, there's those elements as well. But when you come to these kind of jazz bars, it's completely the opposite. It's 1960s. It's totally analog. It's dirty. It's not a part of the modern world. They don't make many accommodations to the modern world.
And I think as well, probably again, without sort of getting too much into it, like in Japan, the new and the shiny and the modern, in inverted commas, tends to be, valued more and seen as more attractive. So, there's not a lot of interest maybe in preserving these kind of places. And I suppose, ironically, what's kind of kept Golden Gai alive actually has been this influx of tourism. I remember chatting with Otsuka-san about that when we were there the second time, and how it seemed like he had this kind of ambivalence about it, because he knew maybe that money coming in from tourists and people becoming aware of Golden Gai more was kind of keeping business going, but also maybe it was, fundamentally changing the character of the place over time as well. And like, as we know, from being in Japan, things change very quickly, and whole areas can just vanish or more or less overnight, and something new pops up. And so, just to have those photographs of Shiramuren for as long as it's there, it's just fantastic. And I'd say the photograph of him, as grainy and sort of gritty as the photograph itself is technically, I just think it's one of the...
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it makes me so happy just to look at it, because of all the good memories I've had of drinking there, and everything about the space. When you're looking at this photo of him, you mentioned the camera bag, which I never had noticed until you just mentioned it, because my attention actually always goes, this is really strange, it doesn't even go to the CDs behind him on the wall, necessarily to him. It goes to almost the center of the picture, of the frame. It's the round wall fan up in the corner of the back wall. And that rotating fan that you see in so many of these old bars and places that we go to, that's the only ventilation you have. And sometimes it doesn't do anything when you've got 8 guys chain smoking in a counter bar like that, and it's roughly 38 degrees centigrade, or high 90s in Fahrenheit, even at night. So you're sitting there, you're sweltering, and it's so smoky, and the music is just blaringly loud. And for some people, they'll just be like, that sounds horrific. But I know for me, these experiences were so special. It was just this is what Tokyo is to me, is these old little joints. And it's just so great that we've been able to capture them, because, like we've talked about, a lot of them are, just disappearing. And God knows what it's going to be like when we get into the post-COVID-19 world economy. I am keeping an ear out for the places what we discussed, some of the kisaten, the jazz cafes and jazz bars, are they going to be able to reopen or not? And I imagine that down the line we're going to do an episode on that as well. As we get out of this situation. But
we're going to stay in Shinjuku anyway for the next couple of episodes. and look at some of the other sort of legendary places, of which there are many, in Shinjuku particularly. So maybe that's a good point to pause this week. If you can hear a weird noise on the recording, we apologize for that. I'm not sure what, there's some kind of weird interference, but we're all learning on our feet in terms of recording this through Zoom and so on and so forth. We got some new intro and outro music this week from Louie Lastic, so thanks to him for giving us that track. James, we'll pick this chat up about Shinjuku next week, and we're going to talk about the problem with samurai. We'll just leave that there and let people have a think about what that might be. In the meantime, you take it easy, stay safe this week, and we'll be in touch next week.
You too. Look forward to it next week. And don't forget, check us out, tokyojazzjoints.com. And is there an Instagram page? There must be one.
You got to be kidding me. Yeah, at Tokyo Jazz Joints, at Tokyo Jazz Joints on Twitter, at Tokyo Jazz Joints on Facebook. You can get us on all the social media platforms, and you can listen to the podcast on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple. So there's no excuse to not listen. Thanks again for all the listens and likes, and we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.